If I could invite the panelists up now, and actually, Phil, do you mind, bringing a couple chairs? We have a special guest with us tonight, and I'm going to have to read it off my phone. So I apologize for that. Anna Lee Ames Froelich, who's the young lady here, bringing over a chair. I think we're, yep. Anna Lee is, I don't want to get in front of the speakers because I'm afraid I'll give feedback, so I'll be out of your way in a second. Anna Lee is a descendant of Union Pacific financier Oakes Ames, yes? And has an interesting background. If I could just read this real quick, she goes by Anna Lee and only recently evolved as an historian, researcher, presenter, and newspaper columnist. It was Sam Arnold, originator and proprietor of the Fort Restaurant in Morrison, Colorado, who convinced her that her family's stories related to the West in the 1800s had historical as well as interest value. She's researched family stories in Missouri, Wyoming, Alaska, Hawaii, and Colorado relating to mining, ranching, railroads, both standard and narrow gauge, architecture, and art. It is the people involved who really make these stories and provide the drama. She does a presentation about the Ames Monument in Wyoming, and she now writes a column for the Colorado Gambler newspaper where she can tell the stories that she's found. She belongs to the Denver Westerners and recently won an award at the Western History Association Conference from Westerners International, the Philip A. Danielson Award, third place for Best Presentation or Program. She's on the board for the Center for Colorado and the West, associated with Aurora Library in Denver, the only tri-campus library in the country. The purpose of the organization is to work with students to gather and digitize Western history. We need to cultivate a younger generation of historians. Anna Lee will be leading and moderating the discussion tonight, so if everybody could just give a round of applause for Anna Lee. And I'm going to turn it over to Anna Lee. She'll get things started, but if you have questions in the audience too, just raise your hand and I'll run around with this mic.
Okay, can you hear me okay? You have to see the final thing because Larry and I are in that one. Okay.
Yeah, you don't have to look at me again after this. Right, Tom?
That's right.
Now we're going to talk about further background of this tonight and about the beginning of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific that came out of the Pacific Railroad Act. And so how did these, Phil can address this, how did the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific arise and get going on this? Out of the act? How did it bring them into being?
Well, certainly the Central Pacific has a somewhat longer history going back to the 1850s when the Big Four got together with an organizer and started developing a railroad within California. And that's often overlooked sometimes when we talk about our side, which is undoubtedly the most interesting side, is the Union Pacific. But certainly that was an important component. But the incentives that came from the 1862 and 1864 Pacific Railway Acts are what really brought those companies in. And those incentives originally were designed to encourage companies to take a shot at building the railroad, but they were sweetened considerably. The incentives were sweetened considerably by the Act in 1864.
Yes.
And made it possible to gain a good deal of land, made it possible to gain a substantial support from bonds, and also set it up so that bondholders would not have to be second to the federal government with respect to any form of foreclosure or anything of that sort.
Well, Larry, why was it necessary that they sweeten the pot? How was it going?
Well, if you take a look at the timeline, and by the way, let's pause on that time. July 1st, 1862. Last July 1st, 150 years old. That was, you know, this is a big deal. We're 150 years out from that event, or from the signing by Abraham Lincoln of that act that created the Union Pacific. The Union Pacific, at the time it was created, didn't really exist. It was just a paper company. And it wasn't until October of 1863 that it actually became a real functioning company. So there, if you think about that, yeah, they had a sweet pot with the Act of 1862, but people weren't willing to put their money into it. No one was willing to show up. So it was pretty important to sweeten that pot so that something would actually happen.
Because this was dependent on investors.
and
So,
if I
and
may-
how did the Civil War affect that, the
Well,
investments in it?
I wanted to add that the pot was sweetened, the government bonds were issued to the railroads at the rate of, to build the railroad, of $16,000 per mile on flatlands, $32,000 per mile in the foothills, and $64,000 per mile in the mountainous regions. And I did a little bit of calculation in today's dollars, and the low end would be about $200,000 per mile in today's money, and the upper end would be about $700,000 per mile. Somebody told me in Cheyenne last night that probably the upper end would be close to $1 million a mile in today's money. So we're talking about, you know, big bucks going on here.
Could I just?
Go ahead.
Yeah, let me add a little bit to that, though. After the Civil War, and because of the Civil War, there was tremendous inflation going on. So a good round figure for what a dollar was worth then versus what it is now is about $20. Except during the Civil War, there was, because of this inflation, it was about $10 of today's money. So you're talking about grossly inflated figures. Now, that's important because they had that money. It was a 6% loan. They paid for things at twice the normal going, which means that but when you figure all this stuff out, they were paying it back, theoretically, if they had paid it back. They were paying it back at 12%, which is pretty darn high interest. So it wasn't really a giveaway. They were loans. And they had a strange series of events much later that complicates everything. So maybe they would have paid it off, maybe they wouldn't. It gets all lost in history, which is Phil's forte.
One other thing I was going to add at the very beginning is that 1862, July of 1862, is very important too, because there were two other acts passed that same week that are particularly significant for Wyoming and particularly significant for Laramie, because one of those acts was the Homestead Act that Lincoln was able to pass and get ordinary people out in the West homesteading. And of course, the second one was the Morrill Act that gave to states monies or land that could be then used to construct mechanical and agricultural universities, those land grant universities. And so that was a really important week for Wyoming and for Laramie to have the Railroad Act, the Morrill Act, and the Homestead Act passed all in that same week. And that, of course, was made possible because the South had seceded, and Jefferson Davis was no longer the Secretary of War. When Lincoln came into office, he was out of there and doing some stuff in the South by then. And so it was a lot easier to get some good legislation passed in the Congress in July of '62.
And I wonder if I can just add one thing, Annalee. There are some posters that commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Pacific Railroad Act. It's a beautiful. I wonder if you could hold one up. It's a beautiful poster put out by the State Historic Preservation Office, and it shows the 844 steaming through western Wyoming. So pick them up, they're all free. There's also another poster over there that shows the Ames Monument, which is a local favorite. And It's a really, you have to look at it close up to see it. It's a beautiful, both of those are spectacular photos. So feel free to take one or two or three. Well, I've only got 50, so you'll have to take maybe 2/3 of one each.
Well, I'll put this out. How did the Civil War affect the funding of the railroad? Well, pick it up, somebody. No, Bill, you want that? How did the Civil War affect the funding?
Well, it certainly would have affected the funding because there were a whole lot of other priorities obviously going on. One important priority was, of course, to make sure that California stayed with the Union. And so, so the very fact that there was the promise of the railroad was very important, even though there wasn't a lot of extra money kicking around to make the thing possible. But the very fact that the plans were announced and the effort was at least underway by 63 and 64, there was at least some sense that it was going to happen, because of course it's really important that the West Coast be connected to the Union, because if you remember from the Pacific Railway surveys of the 1850s, when Congress couldn't decide which route to fund for a potential Pacific Railway, they were looking at routes like New Orleans to the west, Vicksburg, Mississippi to the west, St. Louis to the west, Chicago to the west, St. Paul to the west. Those southern routes were being pressed by southern members of Congress, along with Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. And of course, what Congress did, as you remember from your history, they decided to hand it over to the U.S. Army Corps of Topographical Engineers, and those guys would go out and they would find the best route, and it would take politics out of the whole thing, because sure, those military guys, they're going to be divorced from the politics of it, and they'll come back with honest reports, and then when they deliver their reports to Congress, then by golly, we'll pick the best route based on the science. And of course that didn't happen.
Moving on from the financial part of it, what kind of an engineering feat were they facing, Larry?
It was fantastic. Nothing like it. Well, there's a famous phrase in a wonderful book by Stephen Ambrose, nothing like it in the world. And there hadn't been. And until the space race and we landed on the moon exactly 100 years after the meeting of the rails at Promontory Summit, nothing in the world had happened like that. It was unprecedented, absolutely spectacular. 1,776 miles, which is a nice number for the United States of America.
Oh, really?
And I might add that, you know, it really was considered an engineering milestone. And some people talk about it as being the greatest engineering achievement of the 19th century. And you have to remember, mostly, it was done by hand. It was the last huge engineering project that was done mainly by hand. They did have horses and mules and some mechanical devices, but pretty much it was all hand labor. And they had the numbers to pull it off.
There were no excavators, even though they were in use in the eastern railroads. There were none used on the Union Pacific. It was done mostly with Ames shovels. Got to put in a plug.
Right.
So what about the different groups that worked on it? Phil, like the Irish and
Well, certainly the Union Pacific side didn't have the Chinese labor opportunities that were present for the Central Pacific, and so lots of the individuals that were involved in the Union Pacific were former Civil War soldiers. Some were of German ancestry, some were Irish. Many of them had been in America for a while because they had, in fact, been some of the soldiers that had fought in the Civil War, mostly on the Union side. There were a few that were on the Confederate side by the end, but mostly Union soldiers. And of course, the camp followers were a very interesting variety of people as well.
the Hell on Wheels
The Hell on
towns
Wheels crowds,
is a whole different subject, yeah. So it was built mostly by hand, and boy, these were brave folks to come across Wyoming. Did they stop in the winter?
No, they kept building. They kept building in the winter, and then they hit the red desert area in the middle of the summer. And if you can imagine the conditions, I mean, people were keeling over, horses were dying, mules were falling over dead in their tracks. It was miserable, miserable work, but they persevered and got it done. Basically, they covered the entire state of Wyoming, except for the very beginning portion of it. They got through the entire state in the year of 1868.
There was one brief respite during the winter and early spring of 67, 68 with the construction of the Dale Creek Trestle. And that sort of held them up because that was one of the biggest obstacles on this end of the Transcontinental Railroad.
Right, and speaking of Dale Creek, this past summer I went out with, Larry took us out, Anna Lee joined us, and Jerry back there too, Jerry Hansen. We went to Dale Creek and we went to Ames Monument, and we were cross-country quite a bit in Wyoming and had some rather great adventures.
I was the only one who didn't get sunburned.
I got badly burned. Forgot my sunscreen that day.
What about the people who were involved? Larry, I know, has a lot to say about Dodge and his role in this area.
Well, yeah, there's a place between Laramie and Cheyenne known as the Gangplank. And it had been used and walked upon and stumbled across for at least 15 years. Jim Bridger camped at its base in 1850 on the Stansbury Party. But the interesting thing about all these people who had been working around it for those 15 years is none of them ever realized its potential as a railroad route. Dodge, in his diary in 1865, on September 22nd, nice day, solstice, equinox, excuse me. I'm a geographer, I should know those things. They made a trip. They were going from Fort Laramie down to Fort Collins. And they were on an existing trail that goes, in fact, straight across the Gangplank. Dodge and his crew, Dodge and a few of his people went up Lodgepole Creek, which we all know of, got to about Upper Tie City campground. Most of anyone who lives around here is familiar with that. Crossed over to the vicinity of the Summit Rest Area and went up probably on Pilot Hill, one of the high peaks right around there. And in his diary, he mentions looking out at the Laramie Plains and seeing all the mountains and the passes and so forth. And then they followed the ridge line out to rejoin the main contingent of the troops that were going from Fort Laramie to Fort Collins. Now, in the process, by staying on the ridge line, you come to this natural feature called the Gangplank. Dodge, in his later, embellishes the story a little bit and talks about an Indian encounter. I'm not going to take a stand one way or another about the Indians, but there's absolutely no dispute from his diary and what he says then and the route that he took that he had to go across the Gangplank. And a few days later, he corresponded with James Evans, who was the engineer, the surveyor out here, and asked Evans what he was proposing as the best route at the time, and Evans responded in a telegram that, in his opinion, the route from what modern-day LaPorte up into the Laramie Plains, following the old overland trail, i.e. 287, he thought that would be the best route. So you follow the Platte, then the South Platte, then the Poudre River, and then in the vicinity of LaPorte, you head north. That's the route that the overland trail was taking. And that was the route that Evans proposed in the fall of 1865. Well, Dodge received that telegram just a few days after he'd seen the Gangplank, or at least had been on the Gangplank. Presumably he saw it, because the wheels started going. A few months later, in the spring of 1866, Dodge was finished with the Army, working for the Union Pacific, directed Evans to take a look to the east of a place that Evans had discovered the previous year, and it had the name Evans Pass. Evans Pass is basically where the Ames Monument is. That's the essential area. Dodge told Evans to search east from there, and you might find a suitable route. Evans did, found the gangplank, waxed eloquent about it. There were some haggles back and forth about the best route, and they really did intensively look at several different possibilities. But in the fall of 1866, the board of directors of the UP did approve the gangplank route. Now, that's an important route. It kind of does away with the Rocky Mountains. You have Easterners in particular have the impression that, you drive west, you hit the mountains, there's this huge wall. Well, in most cases there is. But if you drive from Cheyenne to Laramie, you go from the Great Plains into the Rocky Mountains and you don't even know it. It's just a flat, continuous plain, this gangplank. From ship to shore is a gangplank. Well, from the Great Plains to the Rocky Mountains, that's that natural gangplank, that ramp that just takes you without a break from the Great Plains onto the flat surface at that point of the Rocky Mountains. It's a spectacular route. It's the easiest possible route, and it was so easy that it made it difficult to really say, where the heck are the Rocky Mountains? And that was an important part, because it was 16,000 miles on the plains. Over the mountains, it was 48,000. Then in the intermountain basins, it dropped down to 36, or 32 rather. So it made a big difference where the heck the Rocky Mountains started. If you drive on Otto Road, and you come out of Cheyenne on Otto Road, and you go past the Dino Noble fertilizer plant, big, huge plant there. About a half a mile to the west of that is a nondescript little shack. There is no sign, there is nothing at all, and unless you have seen it, you don't realize that that is the east base of the Rocky Mountains. You look out, where the heck are they? Well, I don't know.
And of course,
Nothing on the ground.
And of course, there used to be a little sign there that would say, "Welcome to the Rocky Mountains."
My God, it went from 16,000 a mile to 48, and what? Why? Well, but the gangplank made that necessary, because there was no natural place where you hit the Rocky Mountains. They'd have been in California before they ever got to the Rocky Mountains. And of course, that's absurd. So anyway.
Well, maybe the next time that people drive between here and Cheyenne and back, you'll look at it differently. It is fascinating when you know what you're looking for. All right, I'm going to ask.
Question.
That was very interesting, Larry. Isn't it true that later on they changed the route slightly? Did they not quite get it right the first time, or?
In 1901.
And why did they change it at that point?
Well, because the Harriman had taken over, and he was efficiency. And the route up to the Ames Monument took 2 engines. They had to go over Dale Creek Trestle, which we'll talk about, and it was just a difficult route, so he changed it.
And he cut off about 40 miles across Wyoming by shortening a lot of those.
Yeah, we did a lot of shortening to save only 40 miles.
39 miles. Yeah.
No. We'll talk about this.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going on to other individuals. I'm going to ask Tom, because I liked the research he did, to speak about my ancestors, Oakes and Oliver Ames.
We could be opening up a basket of hornets here, maybe.
No, not actually. What you said before, I told you I loved you from the beginning.
Okay.
Because of
Well, Oakes and Oliver Ames were the chief financiers for the Union Pacific, and Ann Lee is a descendant of Oakes Ames, who was a U.S. congressman from Massachusetts. This was the family that started the Ames Shovel Works, and I believe the Ames label still exists today.
It's part of True Temper now.
True Temper, right, right.
Yeah.
So sometimes if you go to the hardware store, you'll see an Ames branded
They aren't made
tool.
like they used to be.
So this Ames Old Colony shovel was was a fabulous tool. It was used in the California gold fields extensively. It was used to build the Union Pacific Railroad.
And it was used in the Civil War at Lincoln's request.
Yeah, yeah,
He said, keep us supplied with shovels.
right,
Yeah.
right. So, Oaks Ames was asked by Lincoln to really get this Transcontinental Railroad, the Union Pacific portion of it, financed and going. And Oaks Ames took it as his patriotic duty to do just that. And this is where credit mobilier comes in.
We're going to go there now?
I don't know.
Yeah, no, it does.
Yeah, it
But
does.
it's down the line a bit because,
Yeah.
first of all, he's signed a contract for $47 million to make sure the railroad would go through.
That's right.
He had put himself on the line. And I'm going to speak up here because he paid the last $2 million of costs of the Union Pacific because they had no money left. And he paid $6 million in debt of the Union Pacific when it was over.
This is when the railroad was completed.
Yes,
Yes.
and so at that point, he had paid the last $8 million of the railroad, and after that, he got skunked by Congress.
Well, he was kind of, I think, the scapegoat for this whole credit mobilier scandal that occurred after the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. There was a lot of
Yeah,
graft and vice and greed going on.
at many levels.
On many levels. And poor Oaks, I think, was singled out as the scapegoat. He was censured by Congress and
For bribery, but not one congressman was accused
That's
of
right.
accepting bribes.
that's right. And Oaks Ames was censured, and he took it pretty hard, and I think he was in pretty dire straits emotionally, and 3
died.
months later he had a stroke and died. And that was the end to that sad story.
However, later than that, and I'm forgetting the date right now, the Supreme Court ruled that the credit mobilier and the Union Pacific had no debts to the country and were not culpable, which, it's
Certainly a good example of creative financing anyway, because they did organize it in such a way that people hadn't really recognized some of those loopholes that had been established. It's a bit like us looking back at the derivatives market and trying to understand how that worked, because what they essentially did was to have a separate construction company with separate ownership, and of course the board of the Union Pacific was hobbled in a way by having some U.S. government representatives on the board. So either hobbled or assisted, because then of course they could go back to Congress and ask for additional bonding support based on what Credit Mobilier was saying was needed in order to continue the track.
every railroad
So it
in the
worked very
country,
well.
every railroad in the country had a construction company.
Yeah,
And they had them to take liability off the actual railroad.
right. Mhm.
And it was not like it was the only one.
Oh no, but
But-
it's a creative way to finance, so that you don't directly have to be having your finger in the pie. You can have other people's
Well, while you're at
fingers
it,
in
who
the pie.
started the Credit Mobilier, Phil?
What?
Who started the Credit Mobilier?
Well, certainly it would have been Durant and his buddies. that did
George
that.
Francis Train
Train,
and Durant.
We can talk about Durant a little bit.
Yeah.
Thomas Durant was the vice president of the Union Pacific, and he kind of was a schemer and a scoundrel and out to line his own pockets, which he did very well. And Thomas Durant, throughout this whole thing, you know, they're going across Nebraska. Nebraska's, as we all know, is pretty flat, straight shot, and he was doing these big horseshoe curves, and
He did one
he did one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
at the start, the oxbow.
Yeah, that's
and
correct.
none others. So let's
Okay.
don't over.
That Hell on Wheels
But-
TV thing
that
would
first
like to
one
tell
was
you
an extra
differently.
9 miles.
But he was also, though, didn't he have his own surveyor? And wasn't
Yes.
he always trying
Seymour.
to go against Dodge?
Silas Seymour.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And they were always trying to reroute from Dodge's original route. So much so that at one point Dodge really got fed up with it and said, "This is enough. We're going to have a meeting." And they had this big meeting south of Laramie here at
Fort
Fort
Saunders.
Sanders. And Thomas Durant walked into this meeting thinking that, you know, he'd get his way, and lo and behold, Dodge had assembled some of his buddies that turned out to be Civil War generals.
Grant and Sherman
And Ulysses
and
Grant, who was running for
Sheridan.
president that year, and they set Durant straight, and he kind of skulked out, but still continued to try to change things.
Yeah, he was a thorn in their side the whole
Yeah,
time,
yeah.
you know. Let's see, who else are we going to talk? How about, another thing about Durant, that he got the name of the company through George Francis Train, his friend, from France. And that company went under in disgrace. It was copying a name from the one in France.
Yeah.
And Train was behind a lot of what he did, but you don't see his name as often.
Right.
Well, okay, who else? The
May I
casement.
just
Yeah, you go
parenthetically
ahead.
ask? We've been pronouncing it Credit Mobilier, which is fine with me. I just wonder how many people in 1868, especially tie hacks and track layers and gandy dancers, would have called it Credit Mobilier. It's kind of like Credit
The
Mobilier,
Ameses.
and I kind of think the frontiersmen might have pronounced it that way.
Actually,
I would love to ask a linguist.
Even the Ameses in Massachusetts, because of the Boston accent, say Credit Mobilier. So it's different things. It depends whether you use the French or the whatever.
It was just nice to
I've
have the
always-
name because French companies were trusted in those days to be able to return a good investment in forms of dividends. So it was a good, solid name to use if it had any kind of a French connection. I suppose they could have called it Napoleon, and they would have had the similar sort of success in attracting investors.
What about the Casement brothers? Who would like to speak about their role in this? Larry?
Absolute heroes. They were the people on the ground who got it built. Jack Casement, we have his papers here at the AHC, including a fascinating series of letters between he and his wife. Jack Casement was in charge on the ground. He was the man out on the lines. He's the guy, if you've ever seen the pictures, they're wonderful, dressed like a Cossack on a horse with his big Russian hat and his saber. It's just picturesque as all Billy be damned. The Frontier Index gives just a rollicking description of the entry of him and his men into Green River, and the editor, the writer, talks about his Mexican spurs jangling and blah 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 blah. It's just a wonderful picture. Jack Casement was just a tiger. His brother Dan Casement was in charge of the logistics of actually getting all that stuff out there to the line. Excuse me. So the two of them were giants in the whole construction thing. Without them and without the leadership of Dodge and the Casement brothers and a lot of other Civil War generals and high-ranking officers and a lot of Civil War people, a lot of military experience, the project would never have come to fruition. They had 15 years. Congress gave them 15 years to do it. They were finished in 7. It was an amazing achievement.
And they really worked the track layers hard. They were, in direct competition with the Central Pacific, and I think we were talking about this yesterday, that the Central Pacific had set a record for track laying. Maybe you could expound on that, Phil.
10 miles a
10
day.
miles, and then, of course, this side had to at least come close to rivaling it, if not passing it. So it was a big race. But, of course, the trouble is that the quality of the construction wasn't really fit for the long term. It was okay for the short term, but in respect to the long term, after a few people like Jay Gould and others got involved in the financing in the late 70s and into the 80s, the railroad was pretty well run into the ground with respect to its ability to keep the rolling stock onto the tracks, because it was, as I think Jim Ehrenberger said last night, it was viewed as two rows of rust going out west, because they just really didn't do much in terms of maintaining it. And so after the Union Pacific took bankruptcy in 1893, and Harriman a couple of years later bought it from the bankruptcy referee, he embarked on a very ambitious effort to modernize the tracks. And that's when they, like you said, that they dropped off the Dale Creek Trestle, where it was down to 5 miles an hour, 3 miles an hour to cross or something like that, legally, and modernize it in such a way that they didn't have the same troubles with occasional floodings taking out the tracks at various points, and pretty well put it on the route that we know now as the Union Pacific route across Wyoming.
I have a wonderful diary entry from Oliver Ames where he's standing up there at Dale Creek and saying, "We're going to have to build a trestle." And it was quite a trestle. What about, you were listening to Jim Ehrenberger last night, so what did he have to say about the early steam locomotives and their power and size? Anything? I can't imagine he was quiet about it.
I don't think that question came up, actually.
It's on here. No, it didn't come up. Well, he certainly could answer it. What about you guys? Anybody have knowledge of that much knowledge about the engines? Okay. So what was the impact of the railroad on the United States, economically, socially, globally?
Well, I guess first off, the most obvious thing was a journey that used to take months was overnight, days. I mean, it was absolutely transformational for America. Not only could it move people, but also goods from coast to coast. And this happened, at the culmination of the railroad, but it was instantaneous. And so the other part of it, I guess, would be it really finally connected the country together. It was the United States of America from coast to coast, and you can go across it. There's more.
Of
course, historian Richard White makes the case that the Transcontinental Railroad was basically a big waste of money.
That's right.
I'm sort of paraphrasing him here, but and it really didn't bring about anything particularly important, and I of course would take issue with that, because it did bring about Wyoming after all. As the first territorial governor said, John A. Campbell said, this was the one territory that had to come into existence because a railroad had passed through, rather than the other way around. When a territory is established and they're begging a railroad to come, it's the other way around out here.
Well, in the east.
So it created Wyoming, and so I think that's the most important.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing that the railroad did. That is from my point of view.
In the east, the railroads all went to existing towns. But here, it created these towns as
Right,
it went.
It was the exact opposite. It preceded population. And speaking of, the creation of Wyoming, Wyoming was part of Dakota Territory when the Union Pacific first started coming through. There was no state border at Nebraska. By the time that they got halfway through, the good citizens of Cheyenne lobbied for a territorial status, and in 1868, in fact, Wyoming did become a territory because of the Union Pacific coming through.
But of course, we didn't get any officers initially because, again, as sort of a throwback to some of the Civil War issues, Andrew Johnson was the president at that point, and he was embroiled in a dispute with Congress over Reconstruction. And of course, the Republican majority in the Congress was not about to let Johnson's appointees become territorial officers in this far out territory of Wyoming. And so consequently, Wyoming really had been created as a territory, but it hadn't really been established as a territory because the Congress balked until Grant became president, and then Grant was able to appoint the first set of territorial officers that would be ratified, their appointments would be ratified by the Senate. And so that didn't happen until March of 1869, and of course the railroad was by that time already at the other end. It was already
Well, they had until
closing in on Promontory.
1875 to finish, and their contract allowed them till 1875, but because of the race with the Central Pacific for land, it created the shoddiness of the railroad. And
But that's why we didn't have much of a territorial government, because we had to rely on people like M.C. Brown, who was mayor of Laramie for 2 weeks and resigned because he said that Laramie was essentially ungovernable. You all remember that?
Was that before
I'm sure
Sheriff
there have been
Boswell
council
came?
members and mayors that have been saying that about Laramie ever since. But and then of course we had some issues with vigilantes, and then we also had what is statistically, I guess, considered the most lawless town in world history. Benton is supposed to have had the highest homicide rate of any town in world history. It was something like a 400% homicide rate. But the way that's calculated is that the town lasted less than 3 months. The population during that period was about 3,000 or so. But by the time the census was taken, it was down to about 10. And therefore, you didn't have to kill a lot of people to have a 300% homicide rate. But that's I've seen that published many times in books that, oh yeah, there's these awful places in medieval Europe where they killed all these people, and all this awful stuff that happened in the 20th century. But Benton, Wyoming, that's the homicide capital of all time. Benton,
But that's not to say it wasn't a nasty place, because
No,
it was.
yeah, and there's not a lot left there. So that Alkali Flat just outside of Sinclair is about all you can see left of Benton.
Excuse me, Anna Lee, we've got a question over here, and we're starting to get low on time, so I'm thinking maybe we'll take this question and a couple more. If I could make a quick announcement, there's another question here, so we've got a couple audience and another one. Okay. If you would like to put your name in the drawing for the DVD, why don't you raise your hand right now, and we'll get you some tickets for that, and we'll get some of these audience questions asked.
Okay, who's asked, you have a question? No, you're asking for the other, putting your hands up for two different things, man. Okay.
I was just curious if we could go back for a second about the formation of Wyoming at the time. With the railroad being such a valuable asset to the territory and so many states being formed relatively close to that time, how was Wyoming able to hold on to the land that surrounded the railroad, and it didn't get sucked into other states or other territories?
Well, one important thing is that it was part of Dakota Territory initially, and if you might remember from your history, the legislature of Dakota Territory and the governor of Dakota Territory actually petitioned Congress to do something with that appendage, that far western county that we really don't want to have to handle. because in the East River of Dakota, where the capital at that time was Yankton, they were interested in helping farmers and a more or less stable population, and they didn't want to have to pay for the governance of that far-flung western county that would have included what's now Wyoming. And so we're one of those very few territories that got established because essentially Dakota said, hey, we don't want it. Take it, do something with it. So that's the reason. As far as the other states being predatory, I think the only time where that almost occurred was in 1872 when Grant was asked if he would see fit to incorporate the southern part of Wyoming into Colorado. And I think that's the only instance that I've encountered. Of course, Montana already thinks they own Yellowstone. So, they still think they own Yellowstone, so I guess we can't fight them all off.
There's a little finger of Montana.
There's a little bit. Okay, fair enough, Montana. Tom.
Okay, I think we have one question over here, and then we had another one over here. Okay.
I had a question about how did, I have a statement too after this, but how did the railroads get involved with the time zones? I've heard the time zones were created because of the railroads, if you guys know that. And then I just had a statement. We just scratched the surface on Annalee Ames tonight, and she's just an amazing person that you need to know more about. I have a radio show on KLM 1061 on Sunday morning. I interviewed her today, 45 minutes. We got some amazing stuff about Ames Monument, and just as a little tidbit to get you hooked, she was one of the people that is directly descendant of...
The sister of Richard III.
the sister of Richard III. So.
Yeah.
In terms of time zones, certainly there was no need for standard time back in the days when the counties would be established in places like Indiana and Iowa as distances from which you could take a horse and buggy and make it to the courthouse and back in time in one day. Those sorts of days went by the boards when we had railroads then, so counties didn't have to be quite as small, obviously, but if you're going to have any kind of a dependable schedule for a railroad, you're going to have to come up with a standard time, and so I believe Wyoming's territorial legislature adopted the standard time for Wyoming in, I believe it was in 1885. Is that right, Larry? I think it's 1885. If Cheryl Wells, or Professor Cheryl Wells were here, she could tell me because she studies time and she does a lot on time zones. But I think it was in the territorial legislature of '85 that Wyoming signed on, and that caused the entire railroad then to be at least standardized. The Wyoming stations went on with others. Now, I can't describe exactly why the mountain time zone was drawn where it was, but I've always contended that that's really the beginning of the West, is where the mountain time zone starts, and western Nebraska is part of the West. Eastern Nebraska is not, because that's where the time zone breaks.
Let me just
Yeah,
add.
there's one more question, I think.
Yeah, I'd like to. On the standardization of time, there's a physical reason as well as scheduling. You go from here to here, and you do it on a single track. And if you have a train coming this way and a train coming this way on that single track, that's an invitation to disaster. So you have to have a reliable way so that this engine knows that it could reach this little siding and get off that single track to allow this other train to pass, or vice versa. So the physics of the trains themselves, that single track, forces time to be of paramount importance. Hence, since you need some standardization.
Okay, you had a question?
Yeah, I just have one question. It's about Howell, Wyoming, which is just north of Laramie. And I was just kind of curious, as I know that the tracks used to go down Howell Road, And I was just wondering that, I know that there used to be a watering station there, and at what time did they, do you guys know when did they divert the tracks over to 30 or to Highway 30 away from the trains, and I guess the history of Howell and why?
The easy answer is 1901. It may have been 1902, it may have been 1900, but any place within the county, in fact, any place from Cheyenne, clear on over probably to the Red Desert where there's realignments, if you say 1901, it's a pretty good estimate. That was the Harriman reroute.
And of course, that's where Wyoming is out by there.
Yeah.
And Wyoming was the location where there was a telegrapher by the name of John Allen, A-L-L-Y-N, who was a childhood friend of Thomas Edison's. And so when Edison came through to look at the solar eclipse in Rawlins in 1878, he stopped at Wyoming, and stayed the night with his old friend there, John Allen, who was the telegrapher at Wyoming, which is fairly close to Howell.
To make it
Distance.
more
They
efficient.
saved 3 miles. The reroute saved 3 miles. It,
Well, close to 40, but 3.
Well, no,
yeah.
that dog leg she's talking about.
Oh, that dog leg. Oh, yeah, okay.
That saves 3
Fair
miles.
enough. Okay.
Okay.
The Albany County has the biggest reroute of any place, by the way, between basically Rock River and Medicine Bow. The old route was about 12 miles longer, and that's the longest diversion anywhere on the entire route, where they had a savings between the new route, the Harriman reroutes, and the original lines. It's right here in Albany County.
Larry happens to be the steward of the Ames Monument in Albany County. Yes. Anything you want to say about the Ames Monument?
Well, we're in the process of having it nominated for a National Historic Landmark, and we think we'll be successful, and we should know within about a year. So cross your fingers for us. That will be a big feather in our cap to have that happen. And also, thanks to Anna Lee, I got to go inside. It's 70 years old. I got to crawl inside this stupid cave. You go up there and you think, oh, it's solid granite. Bull. It's hollow granite. It's just a hollow shell. But it's a beautiful hollow shell.
The center part is about 28 feet square inside. It's a 60-foot square. You can walk around the perimeter inside, but we had to belly crawl for 10 feet to get in. And then there are pillars on the corners. You got in, though.
I did.
And then there are pilasters that come up along the center part, and they go out in corbel arches and support the outer wall. And because we had done that, the team that is working on the landmark designation said they would not have taken it on for the size of the grant we had we not cared enough to have done that.
And of course, I was in there when I was not in there this time, but I was in there when I was a much younger kid. And I won't tell you why I crawled in there, but
Yeah, I can imagine.
sometimes that was done in
Yeah.
that area back
But nobody really
when college
recorded
kids
it.
used to occasionally go up there.
We measured it, photographed it. I had architects in there. So that made it official.
Yeah, there used to be a
And now it's
block on the
sealed up.
southwest corner that was not there, but
Well, the
they cemented
southwest,
that up.
it's covered up very thoroughly
Oh, yes,
now.
yeah, well, that was
Yeah,
done
and
sometime
so-
after 1967, 68, too.
We had it opened in 2010. It had been blasted shut by the state in the mid-1980s, which just scares me to think the way it's built, of blasting it. But that was the thrill of my lifetime, getting it there. I didn't think you thought it was a dumb old cave.
I'm just pulling your leg. I had this beautiful photograph of you smiling, just
You took some.
cherubic.
He took a picture of me.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Well, folks, thanks for coming out. We appreciate it. Remember to grab one of these posters in the back. Did we gather all the tickets for the drawing? Do we have them all? Okay, here's a couple more.
And thanks to Tom and to Wyoming Public Television for letting me be a part of this project. I enjoyed
Oh,
it very
yeah.
much.
Yeah, it's been
real
great.
quickly, if I could, because somebody requested, if the panelists would please identify themselves again so that they know who was saying what. Annalee, of course, is here on my right.
I'm Larry Ostrich. I'm the president of the Depot Association. Welcome to our lovely Laramie Depot.
And he's also was very involved with the train, the heritage train, what do you call
Yeah,
it?
come see our train. It's a snow train. Wait for good weather.
Yeah, I'm Tom Manning. I'm writer-producer of End of Track.
Yeah.
And I'm Phil Roberts, and I teach at UW.
And thank you for coming out tonight, panelists, moderator. Thank you, folks, for coming out. Do we have a name here? Do you want to?